Hello, this is Speaking Volumes. My name is Derek Turner. Today we'll be talking about a book by Peter Quennell called Four Portraits, Studies of the 18th Century, first published in 1945. Peter Quennell was born in 1905. His father was an architect, but he and his wife became famous as the co-authors of a best-selling children's history called A History of Everyday Things in England. Quennell's own first work was published when he was just 17 in an anthology called Public School Verse. This brought him to the attention of the Bloomsbury set, although they quickly dropped him again. Virginia Woolf referred to him as an exiguous worm. Quennell went to Oxford but was sent down for, quote, spending a night with a woman from Reading. He went off to Venice in the company of John Betjeman, where they spent a riotous time spending their parents' money and drinking and carousing and carrying on numerous love affairs. While there, Quennell had a letter from his father, which gives some indication into his family background. His father wrote, "Had it not been for this unfortunate incident at Oxford, you could have been now with your mother and myself on our tour of the medieval castles of Wales." Quennell went on to become a book reviewer, writing for the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, and he became the editor of Cornhill magazine, and he was the founder and long-time co-editor of History Today. He also co-wrote books or edited the writings on Lear, Baudelaire, Shakespeare, Dr. Johnson, and famously Lord Byron, on whom he was an acknowledged expert. He earned the lifelong hatred of Evelyn Waugh, whom he had known at Oxford, by humorously reviewing Waugh's first book, in which he insisted on pretending that Evelyn Waugh was a woman, all the way through referring to him as Miss Waugh. Waugh in turn referred to him as Fuddy-Duddy Fishface, and once in clubs came up to him and jumped up and down on his feet. Four Portraits is a study of four people, all extremely different, but all in their way representative of different aspects of the 18th century, a century which appears to have particularly appealed to Quennell. Their character sketches drawn with great clarity and great sensitivity and very elegantly written, a sensitivity particularly marked because Quennell himself was notoriously repressed. He once told A.N. Wilson he hadn't cried since he was 7. The four characters are James Boswell, Edward Gibbon, Laurence Sterne, and John Wilkes. We first meet Boswell in 1763 when he's a young Scottish aristocrat come down to London to make his mark, where of course he meets Dr. Johnson at his own insistence and strikes up an unlikely rapport. We follow Boswell as he goes on his tour around Europe and all around London in his complex, multifaceted personality. He's bumptious, he's also insecure, he's hypochondrial, he's also puppyish, he's keen on the pleasures of the flesh, he likes drinking and womanizing. He also likes going to literary salons, has religious doubts, makes friends with Voltaire, and interests himself in the cause of Corsican independence. And at the end of it, somehow, this unlikely person comes up with one of the great biographies of all time, which Quennell calls a new and revolutionary mode in thinking and in literature. We then move on to Edward Gibbon. We first meet him in 1762 when he's about to set off on his grand tour, which of course resulted in one of the most extraordinary books of all of the 18th century and indeed of all history. Gibbon had just spent several frustrating but formative years as a militia officer. These were frustrating years for him because he disliked the philistinism of most of his fellow officers. He hated the enforced drinking of the officers' mess, the so-called bumperizing, which they were all expected to partake in. They were nevertheless formative years in that they gave him great character into his own country and into his countrymen, and indeed probably later fed into his understanding of Roman military history. He was about as unlike Boswell as it's possible to be. He was small and overweight, as Quennell describes him very memorably. He had a touch of absurdity. Looming behind are the huge relics of the splendid historical past. The foreground is occupied by a small, unshapely figure in ruffles and in bagwig and flowered velvet coat. with his forefinger outstretched as he prepares to rap upon his snuff-box, while from a mouth grotesquely circular stream the long, euphonious periods of his measured monologue. Unlike Boswell, he was washmish. He was sometimes contemptuous of people in the mass. He was polished. He was urbane. He was prone to cynicism and irony. An irony which, Quennell said, so sometimes descended to the type of innuendo favoured by men of letters, anxious to remind us they're also men of the world. His writing, Quennell says, was characterised by unctuous anticipation and complacent detachment. The ironic detachment of Gibbon may well ironically have contributed to the undermining of his century's classicist foundations. Nevertheless, as Quennell notes, its ability to cherish Gibbon would appear, in the last resort, to be the true standard of any age's culture. Laurence Sterne represents another side of the 18th century. For Quennell, he's plainly the least attractive of the four characters profiled. Sterne's father, Roger, was a soldier and a brave one. During a duel, he was transfixed to the wall by the sword of his opponent. With remarkable sang-froid, he asked his opponent to wipe the point of his sword before withdrawing it, to avoid the possible introduction of foreign objects into his blood, which would be, said Roger, disagreeable. Sterne rather hero-worshipped his father, in contradiction to the feelings for his mother, which appear to have been largely feelings of shame, snobbish guilt. Sentimentality is a word that Sterne appears to have coined. Quennell overall finds Sterne showily unconvincing as a stylist and perhaps as a human being. He says that his literary style is often slightly repulsive. He points out that the fine apostle of the apostle of fine feelings and of sentimentality did not necessarily extend this to all areas of life. For example, when Sterne was a parish priest in a village in Yorkshire, where he spent many years, he helped to arrange the enclosure of a large area of common land which had previously been used by the villagers. His sensitivity clearly did not extend to the wrongs of the labouring masses. But to go back to the unconvincing nature of his style, Quennell talks about the love affairs of Sterne and how strange they seem. He calls them startlingly inhuman, fluttering in tremulous rounds, quivering suspended in a rapt excitement, as do certain birds whose amatory displays would appear to be designed no less to stimulate their own erotic frenzy as to capture the attention and arouse the senses of a casually encountered female. Quennell makes a serious, but if a rather subtle, indictment of Laurence Sterne. He said the cult of sympathy had many unfortunate outcomes. It had, quote, discovered in unhappiness and helplessness a positive moral charm, which thus anticipated the age of Jacobin enthusiasts who, for the sake of humanity, would sign inhuman sentences. We then move on to John Wilkes, the last character in the book. The apostle of liberty, the apostle of press freedom and political self-expression. A man famously ugly, but who was so good at talking that he once said that he could talk away his face in half an hour. And yet this great liberal exemplar became a patriot by accident. Prior to his famous attacks on Bute's administration, he had desperately tried to become a pensioner of the same administration he had applied to become the ambassador to Constantinople, amongst other things. He was also always very interested in personal pleasure and gratification, as Quennell writes. There was no time in his career, even as a popular hero behind the walls of a London jail, when patriotism and pleasure did not run in equal harness. There's a great story in this book about Wilkes's duel with Lord Talbot, whom he had insulted in the North Britain. Lord Talbot, who was the Lord High Steward, had a horse which had been trained to back out of the royal presence. However, during the coronation, it unfortunately decided to back into Westminster Hall instead, to the great hilarity of John Wilkes. The two men fought a duel, firing pistols at each other. Both missed, upon which Wilkes characteristically came up to Talbot and befriended him. They went off and drank convivially together. It shows the essential warm-heartedness and decency of John Wilkes, who never let a mere political disagreement get in the way of a personal like of an individual. He was so warm-hearted as a person, he eventually even captivated the principled disliker of Whigs and Radicals, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson later said, after meeting Wilkes, and a meeting arranged by Boswell, by the way, that he would as sooner do Jack a favour as anybody in the world. In 1780, the great radical apostle even became a kind of de facto conservative, defending the Bank of England, commanding the detachment of guards which defended the Bank of England against the anti-Catholic rioters of Lord George Gordon. 9 years after that, he would be surprised by and deeply disapproving of the French Revolution. Nevertheless, complex person though he may have been, hypocritical though he may have been in some strange ways, or at least inconsistent, he left a real legacy behind him, a legacy of personal freedom, a legacy of freedom of conscience, a legacy of defiance of the government, which in 1945 must have seemed like an extraordinary and worthwhile thing.